celebrate 120 years of bilateral relations in between Romania and the Islamic Republic of Iran, side by side with MEPE and with Euro Defense in Romania. Tons of congrats to Flavius and to Liviu for their humongous, endless, and continuous efforts to set the floor so that we creatively and reflexively think of alternative ways to shape future for us and for the next generation. And not least, what a privilege to share the stage with all these heavyweights. I'm not an expert in the region, although I've got the practice of building paradigms, new ways of thinking in international relations. So bear with me, and with my, let's say, shallow knowledge of the region, I'll just keep my moderator role. Some intro remarks, and so with the technicalities, we skip that. You don't want to embrace that. I'm very happy to fall extensively in line with some of the previous speakers' thoughts, and allow me to echo some of that in a slightly different semantics. I'll give it a reading just to save time. While the Arab Spring effects dominate the experts' discussions on the conflict in the MENA region, few in the academic community and the policy-making realm have refocused on, at least theoretically, on exploring why and what regional integration would mean, not just for the MENA region, but for the world as such. On a different note, there is both an analytical fallacy, because I noticed that I have colleagues in the plenary, I dare say that. So because there is both some sort of analytical fallacy and ideological biasness to tend to consider European regionalization as the standard and the reference in relation to which to compare processes in the MENA region, making a grossly mistake not to take into account the differences into political and development trajectories in the region. Failing to take into account indigenous variables such as the history, the culture, the religion, and not least the geography, it has made the MENA region still a testing laboratory for the West. So, without further ado, I would just give the floor to His Excellencies Dr. Ali Beman Eghbali, ZARCH, the Director of the Eurasia Study Group Institute for Political and International Studies. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
In the name of God, hello to everyone. I am in very difficult situation. I should choose between feeling and again, hello to everyone. I am in very difficult situation. I should choose between feeling and reality, because my feel forced me to speak in Romanian language, but the reality is to speak in English language. But firstly, I try to speak some word in Romanian language. Vă mulțumesc pentru invitație. Am onoare să fiu din nou în București, între prietenii mei, să vorbesc în limba română, limba pe care am încercat să păstrez. Evident, am plecat ultima dată 2002 în România, dar always am încercat să păstrez această investiție, pentru că am înțeles că am învățat foarte mult din România, am învățat de la oameni de știință, am învățat de la vecinii din societate și mă bucur că am onoare să fiu aici și cu ocazie 120 de ani de relații bilaterale. Din păcate ne-au băgat într-un panel care e foarte legat de masa de print. Asta nu știu, e vina mea sau vina organizatorilor. Dar eu încerc să folosesc această ocazie. Vreau să adresez felicitările prietenii noștri din România, pentru că relațiile noastre, într-adevăr, întoarce cel puțin 2 milenii, mai mult de 2 milenii. Aici e foarte greu, în fața domnului ambasador Teodorescu și alți personalități importante vorbesc referitor la relațiilor bilaterale și în același timp vreau să apreciez rolul și acțiunea domnului ambasador, excelența sa domnul Sadar Beidani, care personal sunt recunoscător că dumnealui, domnia sa, a impus un efort mare să fiu și eu la această conferință și mulțumesc lui Dumnezeu, în ultimul moment am reușit să fiu aici. Dar referitor la subiectul pe care am ales, încerc să fiu cât mai pe scurt, cu toate că eu am pregătit un timp prevăzut de 8 și 10 minute. Încerc să fiu cât mai scurt. Vă mulțumesc pentru atenție. The conflict in Ukraine continues to be one of the most crucial global issues, particularly for the Green continent, and it has attracted the attention of government, military, the general public, and its significant economic, humanitarian, energy, and especially security effects are tangible in the Eurasian region and, of course, for all the world. The war will have an impact on the Middle East, particularly on the key players in the region like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other countries. Despite the various analyses and research reports, I'll try to address a few points of the identified component of the Ukrainian conflict in order to answer the following questions. The first question is, considering the key role played by the United States, Britain, and Europe in the competition between Moscow and Kiev, as well as the crisis impact on the regional section, how will the local, international, and especially global order look like? Second question, the three-dimensional conclusion of the Ukrainian war. How long? What will be the geography and how will it end? And the last question is, how does the crisis affect the Middle East region, especially Islamic Republic of Iran, in terms of and threats? One, the conflict in Ukraine, which broke out in the Black Sea region after 2 decades of planning and provision of software and hardware to long-time opponents, namely the United States and Russia. The main cases of the conflict were the parties' increasing demand in negotiation, and of course, according to older, war is simply politically carried out by other means. In other words, the development in Ukraine support the argument for the need of understanding and incorporating global water geography into the explanation and formulation of political and economic geostrategic decision, as well as the monopoly of military and security power in the modern world. Despite the unparalleled expansion of scientific growth and development in the third millennium, those in position of power and capital are intent to decide the modality of interaction between the countries. 3, one of the important effects of the Ukraine crisis and the great tragedy that accompanied it is the emergence of failure of the vision of unilateralism in the post-American era. 4, there is no exact and relevant picture of Russian scenario, both in terms of intelligence and security institution and their historical root in the third millennium. 5, the statement once again highlighted the functional and structural weakness of the international community, especially the United Nations, in achieving its mission of preventing conflict and putting a stop to hostilities. 6, Ukrainian, which is geographically a buffer zone and determines the great power, is required political intelligence and not being to the center of the compromise, whose intelligent and economic capital did not fall victim to enmities between the West and Russia, and perhaps were ways to escape this devastating war. 7. But for the Western Front, there is also a full part of the class which is being talked about incessantly these days, which is known as returning to the paradigm shift to the European Union and NATO. And NATO and EU redouble effort for convergence and synergy, and urge Zelensky to resist obstacles as much as possible. 8. Thanks to the central bank governor, Moscow has been successful in short-term management of the consequence of sanctions, particularly in maintaining the value of national currency. 9. Neither the West is immune to the effect of inflation and energy crisis, nor other part of the world, especially the Black continent, and will face significant grain supplies problem in the medium term. 10. In the most probable scenario, the war will last for a considerable time. Even if the main cities are occupied, the Ukrainians will continue to resist, and the chance of a complete victory of Russia, in which Ukraine will militarily tame, is very small. Of course, the worst case scenario may be a war between Russia and NATO, which could start with an incident or a challenge somewhere along the border with Baltic Republic, Poland, or Romania. On the other hand, the best case scenario in ceasefire is suspension of military operation. 11. I think in 2 minutes I will finish. The conflict is already affecting the economies of many countries in the Middle East and threatening food supplies through the region. Countries such as Yemen, Syria, Lebanon are currently experiencing food insecurity. 12. Diplomatically, the crisis has yet to produce any significant change, rather than increase all revenues around 100 billion USD for OPEC country. Instead, various countries, including Middle East actors, are prevaricating their bet between the United States and Russia, looking for challenges and opportunity for their national interest and security in key and sensitive sectors. However, long-term sanctions against Russia will be challenging for Middle East countries. 13. The Ukraine crisis seems to have provided opportunity for cooperation and synergy between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the countries of the Central Asia and the Caucasus, as well as European and as well as cooperation with European traditional partner in the field of providing energy. Of course, and some important threat is NATO expansion to the Central Asia and, of course, borders of Russia. Last but not least, it is hoped that the approach of focusing on human and rational logic, peace and tranquility will be established to all war-torn regions, including Ukraine, Yemen, and other parts, and that all human beings will be able to coexist peacefully in complete concord, inshallah. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Let me express best wishes of your success in activity, health and security in your personal and familiar life. Mulțumesc foarte mult.
Mulțumim, Excelență. Professor Erzsebet Rosa, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and also I would like to thank for MEPE for including me in this conference already this second time, which is a great honor to me. When I saw the title of the panel, Regional Integration and Region as Such, it was addressed already by several speakers today. First of all, former Minister Adrian Severin, who was speaking about what is a region, how do we define a region? And obviously there is the geographic proximity, and we all know that. But he also referred to the fact that if we use the term region today, we are also referring to a political, cultural, civilizational, maybe even security meaning or concept, as he said. And this was one thing that was very important. Towards the end of the Cold War, or the end of phase of the Cold War, we have started to think about international relations increasingly in regional terms. There were the different ideas by Huntington, by Fukuyama, and the regional security complex theory by Barry Busan and his colleagues. But it is not enough if we look at a place as a region. As it was mentioned by Dr. Sheikh Al-Islami or Dr. Barzagar as well, in their references to different regions, they were saying, and it is an increasingly changing concept, we are using all day long MENA, the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Sheikh Al-Islami was using West Asia and North Africa, as it is increasingly used by India, China, people looking at the region from the east towards the west. So there is a new concept, a new name, a new terminology, if you like. And Kayhan Barzagar referred at some points to the south. So there have been several names, several definitions or non-definitions, but just we always think that, well, we know what we are speaking about, references to a region. But the question is, as was raised, does that region considers itself, sees itself as a region? Well, we could ask the same question about Central Europe, by the way. I mean, where is Central Europe? So there are a lot of different definitions and possibilities, but what I would like to claim is that for the European Union, region has become a terminus technicus, a kind of a tool, and Europe has made up its own definitions of certain regions around the world. And as Europe's world is expanding, then we are pushing the borders of Europe or the spheres from where different influences may reach Europe. We are increasingly using regional terminology, and we are phrasing this. On the other hand, Europe sees itself also in regional terms. So, for example, it is enough to remind you of our integration period to the European Union. First, it was the Central Europeans, the Visegrad Four, then it was Romania and Bulgaria together. You cannot do it alone. You have to wait for each other, and so on and so forth. And Europe, in a way, was promoting also this regional perception. And Europe itself is looking at its neighborhood in regional terms. So there have been several uses of this regional concept. I would claim it is much more a tool by now. We have regions within the European Union. At some point, it was even said that the Europe of regions in the 90s, in the late 90s, but also outside the European Union, maybe it was a fashionable trend to establish regions like the Arab Maghreb Union or even the GCC. But Europe itself tried to make up regions, the Euro-Mediterranean space in its different formats. And finally, especially following them or under the impact also of the migration crisis in 2015 and 16, we have seen a Europe to a region dialogues, an institutionalized format, EU and AU, African Union, EU and the Arab Maghreb Union, EU and the GCC. Whether they operate or not, usually they don't. But the idea is there. I'm sorry to say that, but the idea is there. And then Europe goes as far as in the global strategy of 2016 that it wants to promote cooperation among the regions closer and farther away between the Maghreb, the Mashrek, the Gulf, the Sahel, the Horn. And it's very interesting because then you come to the idea, okay, but how can regions cooperate with each other if they don't have the perception of a region themselves? If there is no institution, I mean, the old question as is raised towards the European Union, whom do you call? I mean, whom do you call if you want to have an EU-GCC dialogue? Obviously, there must be a secretariat somewhere, but is it meaningful? So it is very interesting. And also another idea that with a colleague of mine we have developed is that, okay, so Europe has these set phrases of regions, Maghreb, Mashrek, Sahel, Gulf, whatnot. But these regions are changing, especially if you look at these regions from the point of view of security. And why? Because security perceptions are very important if you think in the regional security complex theories. What we see today, the Maghreb is quietly breaking away from this all-Arab unity front. Of course, emotionally there, culturally there, but otherwise, come on, who cares in the Maghreb about the Israeli nuclear potential? No one. Who cares in the Maghreb about the Iranian nuclear program, if it is really civilian or not? No. What do they care in the Maghreb about is migration and terrorism coming from the Sahel. So this is what makes us claim that maybe it would be worse for the European Union to start a new page. The European Union always tries to adapt, or so far has tried to adapt to the changing realities. But what it did so far was introducing newer institutions. And we have over-institutionalized anything. Like in the Euro-Mediterranean space, we have the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, then we have the neighborhood policy, then we have the Union for the Mediterranean, then we have the global strategy. And instead of changing the whole, what has existed, what has been established is with us to stay. That was the saying of one of my professor colleagues with the European Union. But I think that the time has come that maybe the set regional phrases should be reconsidered. And we should just face the fact that if we want to deal with the Maghreb, we will get a package deal. It will be the Maghreb and the Sahel together. We cannot deal with the Maghreb only because the Maghreb security concerns are looking to the south and vice versa. And then we can say, yes, yes, of course, if we look at the Maghreb, we have to also look at the Sahel. Just realize the fact that they have more in common from security point of view than, let's say, the Maghreb and the Gulf Arab states here, I mean. And so the conclusion would be quite simple. I know it is simple on paper, but politics is always different, I know. So that as far as the European southern neighborhood is expanding, and we have established a multi-institutionalized partnership with a widening geographical scope, global strategy, the strategic compass, and so on. But we still use the same geographical definitions. So we should rather try to readjust our terminology and redefine the borders of the regions with which we aim, or the European Union aims to cooperate. So thank you so much.
So let me give the floor to Dr. Kohar Iskandarian from Armenia, the head of the Iranian Studies and leading researchers at the Institute of Oriental Studies. Please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I come from Armenia, the immediate neighbor of Iran the last 2,500 years. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about the regional transformations and the growing role of Iran as it's seen from Armenia. My presentation touches the regional transformation and the growing role of Iran in two regions, the Middle East and the Caucasus. Any problem in the Middle East in 1960s, 1970s were solved mainly through the two countries in the region, Iran and Saudi Arabia, both of which were allies of United States at that time. After the Islamic Revolution, the United States tried to overshadow Iran's role as if Iran had nothing to do with the region, keeping Tehran from regional processes. The return of Iran's proactive action in the region can be dated to the early 2000s. Iranian President Rafsanjani managed to restore the economic situation after Iran-Iraq war, and the next President Khatami made an attempt to change the image of Iran in the West. In 2001, the September 11 terrorist attacks in the United States became a serious challenge for the Middle East. However, in my opinion, the Iranian authorities were able to turn it into a new opportunity for their country. It was then two serious regional developments took place from which Iran could not remain indifferent. In 2001 and then in 2003, two wars were unleashed in the region, the first in Afghanistan and the second in Iraq. As a matter of fact, the enemies of the Iranian government, namely the Taliban and Saddam Hussein government, were destroyed in the region through the efforts of Western countries. The United States understood very well that it could not achieve serious success in Afghanistan without cooperating with Iran in the war. Barnett Rubin, who served as a special advisor to United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan in 2001, noticed that United States-Iranian cooperation occurred both in the field in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and in a diplomacy where he personally witnessed it. After the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, it was obvious that Americans would not achieve result in peace building and state building without cooperation with Iran. The United States ambassador to Iraq, Ryan Crocker, said, Washington believed Iran may be behind a ceasefire announced by Iraqi Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, and that it had helped to ensure the ceasefire in areas where it wielded influence. There have been hundreds of such acts, both exposed and veiled. Since the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, Iran has been using its influence on Shiite Muslims, regardless of the number of United States bases in Iraq, and Iran's influence in Iraq has been obviously increasing. After the Islamic Revolution, Iran declared itself the protector of oppressed nations, supporting the Arab countries during the Arab-Israel wars that broke out at that time. Iran provides significant assistance to Hezbollah, especially during the Lebanon-Israel war in 2006, which many analysts even call Hezbollah-Israel war. And in 2019, a photo of the three softly smiling men, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, Hezbollah leader Nasrallah, and Quds Forces commander Qasem Soleimani appeared on the electronic account of the former. The posting of such public photos is not very typical of the supreme leader. So we conclude that an attempt was made to send a message to the West, and in particular the Trump administration, that implemented a very aggressive policy in the region, including a pronounced anti-Iranian policy. In 2011, Arab Spring were also felt in Syria, and in a short period of time, a local problem in the country turned into a multifaceted and a multi-level armed conflict directed against the government of Iran's ally Bashar al-Assad. According to the available information, Qasem Soleimani played a major role in persuading the Russian Federation to support Bashar al-Assad. On August 60, 2060, the Russian Air Force flew from the Iranian city of Hamadan to bomb the weapons and fuel depot of the Islamic State operating in Syria. This is a fact is very remarkable because after the Second World War, the Iranian military airports had not been used by any other country. This is circumstance show how important it is for Iran to somehow respond to the transformation taking place in the region, to try to resist the policy of the West near its immediate borders. So what goal does Iran have in the Middle East? First, Iran wants not only to have a strong voice in the region, but also exercise its right to participate in regional processes. Second, it is obvious that despite all the regional changes, there has been an evident competition between Turkey and Iran for centuries. The fast development of Turkey can become dangerous for Iran's national security. In effect, in case of isolating Iran from the regional processes again and applying pressure will force Tehran to turn against its opponents through the most destructive processes. Meanwhile, it is necessary to take into account Iran's place and role in the region to give Tehran an opportunity to fulfill its role of a regional player. Iran wants to assure its place in the security system of the region. Let's turn now to Iran's role in the Caucasus to sum up my presentation. Before the collapse of USSR, with the permission of the official Moscow, Iranian Foreign Minister Velayati paid a visit to the South Caucasus. After the collapse of the USSR, Iran and Turkey quickly recognized the independence of the former Soviet countries and did their best to spread their influence. While Turkish influence was welcomed in Azerbaijan and Georgia, however, in Armenia, Turkey faced the memory of the genocide of Armenian people, which made it difficult for Ankara to enter the country. At the same time, during the war in Artsakh, as you know, Nagorno-Karabakh, Turkey fully supported Azerbaijan. Even later, the normalization of Armenian-Turkish relations was preconditioned, and today it is still viewed through the prism of Armenia-Azerbaijan relations. Armenia did not have such moral and psychological problems with Iran. On March 12, 1992, a temporary ceasefire was reached in the Artsakh war due to Iran's efforts. United Nations Security General Boutros Ghali praised the Iranian mediation mission, but as I mentioned above, the United States was trying to isolate Iran from any political processes. During the last Artsakh war in 2020, Azerbaijan again had the full support of Turkey and defeated the Artsakh armed forces. As for Iran, Tehran was extremely cautious and neutral during the war. As a result, the Artsakh, with its 138-kilometer borders with Iran, passed into the hands of Azerbaijan military. Today, Iran is very worried because, according to available information, representatives of the Israel Special Services have been deployed in those areas and daily monitor the northern borders of Iran. Border Guard Commander in the Iranian Law Enforcement Forces, Brigadier General Ahmad Ali Ghodarzi, in a statement to the Iranian television explained that the Israelis have stationed themselves in important and sensitive location in Azerbaijan with the intention to spy on Iran. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian said that the Israel intelligence presence in Azerbaijan does not benefit this country, stressing that Iran will not allow the Israel entity to carry out activities in the Caucasus region. Iran maintained neutrality in order not to spoil its relation with Azerbaijan, not to jeopardize many economic programs. However, the policy of Azerbaijan makes it clear to Iran that the next problem will be for Iran. A vivid example of this was Erdogan's recitation of a poem in Baku on the unification of the two banks of Araks River, which triggered fury in Iran. It is worth mentioning that the standby policy adopted by Iran during the war was negatively accepted by Armenian society, which is clearly reflected in the results of a number of surveys conducted in Armenia. Public opinion in Armenia slightly changed to the positive when Iran stated that its border with Armenia was a red line, and Tehran supports Armenian territorial integrity, thus preventing Azerbaijan from aspiring to invade Armenian province of Syunik, bordering with Iran. As for the relations between Iran and Georgia, it should be noted that Georgia is trying to fully integrate into the Western world. As long as the Iran-United States dispute is resolved, Georgia will refrain from cooperation with Iran. So what should Iran do to maintain its position in the Caucasus? First, it is obvious that Iran cannot match the Turkish influence in Azerbaijan. Moreover, in case of weakening of Iran's position, Azerbaijan will have ambition for northern Iran. Second, Iran cannot have deep and comprehensive relations with Georgia as the economic sphere is completely taken over by Turkish capital, and Tbilisi will not cooperate with Tehran until the Iran-United States conflict is resolved. Third, Iran has a good political relation with Armenia, but unfortunately the same is not true for the economic sphere. In the case of Armenia, Iran should also already start worrying. The Armenian authorities are trying to negotiate the existing problem with Turkey. This means that after opening of the closed Turkish-Armenian border, the Turkish capital will enter into Armenia and will gradually push the Iranian capital out of the country. I think that in order to keep the Armenia-Iran connecting strong, both sides should seriously consider the programs of deepening economic cooperation as well as the development of scientific ties. In my opinion, this is the only window of opportunity for Iran to be able to stay in the Caucasus and get their foot in the door until the next challenges arise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Abdul Halim Fadlallah, the chairman and at the Consultative Center for Studies and Documentation, Beirut. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizer, my friend Flavius and Mr. Professor Mershon, for this invitation after 2 years of pandemic. The main question of this session is about the integration and cooperation, regional integration and cooperation between the countries, especially in West Asia and Middle East and North Africa. But the question is about the format and the version of successful cooperation and integration, or about the basic principle should be found to go forward in the road of cooperation. I think the problem represented in some critical points. The first one, because the real question, why all the attempts and all the experience in the Arab world, especially, has been failed in the past since the independence, since the middle of the last century. We have some critical points. The first one, the definition and the real defining of common interest. How to define, how to find the real definition of our common interest in the region. We have two obstacles and the problems facing finding this real common interest. The first one, we need to discover our real interest, common interest. We need a real political process. The real political process need a real political regime and real economic regime. This is not found in the Arab world and the region. Because of the nature of our political regime, our economic regime, and because of the role of the elite, dominant elite, which have deviated the understanding of our common interest in the region. We see that in Lebanon, a little bit in Iraq and in the Gulf countries, when the private interest of elite be higher than the common interest of the country. The second reason and obstacles about discovering our common interest, the absence of regional regime. There is no regional regime to control this process, to control this discovering of our common interest, to translate our common interest into policies, into a strategic, into a long-term strategic and policies between the countries. We need the second point, we need to classify the countries in the region between countries accept the rules and the principle of cooperation and integration, and other countries refuse this principle and these rules. We see this classification without names. We see this classification in the region because the private interest of some elite and some countries is higher than others. We need, third, we need to review the last experience of cooperation and integration. On the political level, we see that common institution, the problem is not in the institution or availability of this institution. The problem in the political will, because some countries use the present institution, common institution, for political domination. We see that in a lot on several experiences in the Arab world, especially in the Gulf. One, the declared goals of the GCC is to development, is to enhance the common project, economic project, but the implicit goal is to go for political issue, undeclared political goal, which is to serve an interest for some countries at expense of other countries. If we go to the economic level, we have to witness the negative transformation of the Arab, especially Arab experience, Arab cooperation and integration experiences. After independence, the goal in the middle of the last century, the focus of integration was on the productive investments and major joint projects. The ambition was to go quickly to reach economic unity. In the 19th, after the liberation, new liberal waves in the world and the region, the goal, the declared goal became the growth instead the development. The growth instead the development became the free trade instead of the main and the huge project, huge investment. In the third stage now, the critical transformation and the bad transformation is the economic cooperation has become now closely linked to political polarization in the region and has become part of the existing conflicts between the countries and the axis in the region. In this context, the normalization between some Arab countries and Israel become the pivot of the new wave of cooperation and integration. Why? Why? Because the common interest between Gulf countries and Israel higher and better of the common interest between the two sides of Gulf. The common interest between Emirates and Israel is preferred than the common interest between Lebanon and Emirates. We don't understand this transformation unless is based on an hidden agenda, political agenda. We have some bad definition of the goal of the integration and cooperation. Sometimes the cooperation program is economic, but its implicit goal is political, such as normalization. In other case, the declared program of cooperation is political program, but the hidden and implicit goal is economic, such as the visit of Biden now to the Gulf countries. Finally, we need to revise our experiences of cooperation and integration. At external level, the main factor in this field is the siege and the sanction, which prevent Lebanon to make deep relationship, economic relationship with Syria, the closer country in the region to Lebanon. We couldn't make a real cooperation with Syria at the level of electricity, energy, at the level of trade, at the level of agriculture and industrial issue, but we have to go far to make some level of cooperation. At the internal level, we need to revise our political regime, not at a whole, but the condition which works this regime under them. What's the role of the elite? How we define our common interest? How to go ahead in the road of cooperation or interaction between the countries. Finally, in the conclusion, the development of the region and its stability depend on the political development, but the political development that allows it to accurate and precise identification of common interest and to change the economic strategy to be directed towards production instead of rental economy. Mutual interest, there is no development without this kind of cooperation and integration, and there is no continuity for cooperation and integration without development. There is the mutual interdependency between the political issue and the economic issue. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. I kindly invite Professor Ekaterina Matsoi, Program Director at MEPE, Lecturer at the Islamic and the Middle Eastern Studies Department, Basel University, Switzerland. Professor, the floor is yours. You just firmly press the button.
This one, I see. Thank you very much for your patience. I promise I will finish in 10 minutes. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, though I have been introduced to you as with a kind of academic and professional affiliation, I'm in front of you as a researcher today. And for the first time, I have to add that I'm also not only a researcher in front of you today, I am a citizen of Europe. Why? I have to be objective as a researcher, but today I cannot. I have to admit that in a certain degree, I am affected by this crisis we are experiencing at this point. Therefore, please allow me to share my presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Planet Peaceland, my home. Is the blue and the green planet from the solar system, or at least it used to be also green. Yeah. I have about 8 billion neighbors. They claim that they make efforts to agree upon peace for about 1,000 years, but I'm sorry to report that I cannot say precisely how much progress was achieved. As soon as a few reach some successes, they consider themselves worthy to rule all neighbors and all neighbors of their neighbors. They begin to instrumentalize knowledge and resources to attack people with arms in one hand and usually the white flag of peace on the other hand. I want to assure you that there is no, I'm not sending any message regarding the Yasser Arafat, episode at the United Nations. They used to carry olive branches in the past, but recently they switched to offering freedom, democracy, and credits with preferential interest. But freedom is not brought in oil canister, it must be owned by each and every one of my neighbors. Some are allowed to contribute financially to purchase of arms, while some have to maneuver them on the battlefield. You always get help. While some enter the game and sacrifice their time, food, and more recent time spent under the shower. And sometimes own life, a select elite makes the rules for the rest and coordinate operations while gaining trillions more peaceland tellers than others. The real rules are not very transparent, not so stable and not so important after all, as long as the loans are returned and interests are paid. And when they are not paid, the crisis will start. We have good democracies and bad democracies, good communist countries and bad communist countries, good dictators and bad dictators. Not to mention the so-called freedom fighters or volunteers. Other time they are terrorists. Don't worry for nuclear bombs, environment pollution, toxic waste, or more hurricanes. We are also raising funds to cope with these issues. Therefore, all problems are solved. We'll come again to Peaceland, and please allow me to impress you with the past achievements. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to give up to this confusing discourse and to allow me to state the real reason why I'm here in front of you. I'm just here to testify as a researcher and as a human being that I have tried to find objective, scientific, rational explanations for what has happening for several years now, and not only in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, or more recent Ukraine. The element that connects all the states and somehow explains the situation they're in is a state actors seconded here and there by at least 2 other states, and also about money, a lot of money. I'm not a specialist in the United States history, but only in the manifestation of the presence of the state and various theaters of operations. Therefore, when I first felt in the online space and something was going on to happen in Ukraine and observing certain patterns of the United States and the United Kingdom behavior, I tried to understand what was happening and what to expect on the old continent and beyond. That's why I had to look a little bit more closely at the history of the United States involvement in the World War I. Why? Because though, especially the mainstream is telling us that the Russian Federation is confronting with Ukraine, we know that this is not true. And here it's about a confrontation between global powers, directly or indirect. Therefore, the World War I somehow can offer us some explanation. But before to begin, begin my presentation for the next 10 minutes by now, 5 minutes, 8, let's say. I would like, and I want to assure the Dominican people of all my consideration. So, my presentation title is War as a Business or the Merchants of Death, a brief overview of the United States century. If you have a look, allow me to quote from a book written by a general, a retired general from the United States Army. Of course, now is not anymore among us. And he participated in 3 wars. The last one was the World War I. I quote, "Beautiful ideas were painted for our boys who were sent out to die. This was the war to end wars. This was the war to make the world safe for a democracy. No one told them that dollars and cents were the real reason." Why analyzing war as a business? At this point in history, you are being told the world is arming itself and prepares for war. Propaganda machines work better than ever. This presentation will investigate whether the world is arming itself, is being armed, or is being financed by arms, and wages wars for causes that are initially presented in different packages. If the historical tendencies presented today are making any sense, you might begin to react differently when the term crisis or international community, United Allies are mentioned. Does it work? Mercenaries, war, war for profits do not begin with the English or British Empire or the rise of the United States. However, since the 17th century, first the Anglo and then the American world played a dominant role in global affairs. The presentation suggests neither that this is the first historical instance of such tendencies, nor that the Anglo-American cultural space is the only pursuing profits in wars. It might, however, be the most successful in preparing and waging wars that result in significant economic gains until now. One of the most important consequences of the World War I was that it ruined the world continent, but it also built up a country which is later become the most powerful nation in the world. I'm not going to insist on this and about the importance of first of all, of the United Kingdom and then of the United States when it's about financial center of the world. But I want to insist on this slide, the panics. You know, panics, if you have a look at the history of the United States, panic is actually the equivalent of crisis today. There were many panics in the United States in the 18th and as well in the 19th century. Let's have a look at this academic report. I quote, "Historians have largely abandoned this economic interpretation of American intervention, but data on the impact of the wartime export boom of the United States suggests that it should be reconsidered. The export boom was so large that it would have been difficult to ignore, and its progress corresponds to the time of important decision leading to American belligerency." I'm going to skip many of these, insist on this slide. According to a 1917 study, exports of metals, machines, and automobiles rose from 480 million in 1913 to 1.6 billion in 1916. Food exports climbed from 190 million to 500 and so on. Gunpowder sold for 33 cents a pound in 1914. By 1916, it was up to 83 cents a pound. Of course, have a look only about the fact that DuPont shipped an astonishing 1.5 billion pounds of explosives. And not to mention the active market for DuPont shares, and the stock soared that from 700 to 775 from 182. I'm skipping this. Of course, there were some voices and commission that were questioning the reason why the United States entered in World War I. And there is a Nye committee report from 1934 that mentioned bribery practices. And we have Senator Nye declaration, I quote, "When the Senate investigation is over, we shall see that war and preparation for war is not a matter of national honor and national defense, but a matter of profit for the few." This report claimed that manufacturers of armament pushed America into war and reaped enormous profits at the expenses of official 53,000 deaths. Still, as I know, there were more due to different diseases. The most important is that, assuming that the Nye report was flawed, as several studies also mentioned, one may consider the 1961 warning from outgoing President Eisenhower, when he warned against the establishment of a military industrial complex. I'm not going to give you any more figures. You are tired, I know, so I'm going further. And let's have a look post-1990, decreased military spending 2000. Have a look, 2001, 2002, then we have a peak. The rise of the so-called ISIS, the coalition, and all the Arab states were I don't want to
Professor, I'll
comment more.
kindly invite you to round up like in a couple of minutes.
Well, yes, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
So, the most important is that it's difficult to estimate, by the United States issued the highest value of finance against bank in 2020, because I mentioned at the beginning that money are very important issue on my presentation. Also, we have to look at this slide. Difficult to estimate also, but the top fighter for democracy around the world is cataloged as flawed democracy and the democracy index. And they have a look. Doesn't the rest of the world consider that senators are allowed to approve war spendings to companies from which they earn dividends? Not to mention, if was Nord Stream 2 the trigger somehow for many other things. Belt and Road and Northern Sea route also is very important when thinking about what's happening in Ukraine. It makes an enormous difference whether you have to travel 21,000 kilometers to get from Shanghai to Hamburg, or to take a 15,000 kilometer shortcut through the Arctic. And of course, we have the United States public debt, which has accelerated after 2008, you see. And then we have the total debt outlook, public and private debt. US is struggling with infrastructure, tries to catch up with China, but that became famous for its train roads, bridges, and BRI. Only 2 more slides. The United States manages to make the cards and the rules again. House always win. Do you democratically agree to play? And the last slide, ladies and gentlemen, something that we probably do not know about might have been already planned and agreed upon. Trying to win a game while others change the cards and rules on the run is merely impossible. The art of winning consists of making the cards and rules and eventually playing afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. If the technical assistance team would be able to enable us to hook up online, shall we get on Dr. Shaban Kardash from Turkey? Brilliant. So Dr. Shaban Kardeş, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science and International Relations, University of Economics and Technology, Ankara. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I guess you can hear me without any problem.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I wish everybody a good day. I am so sorry to not be able to make this travel. My dear friend Flavius was kind to send an invitation, but we are just on the eve of a big holiday as part of the Eid celebrations. Somehow I couldn't arrange my timing. And then I'm going to talk about the Turkish foreign policy towards the region from a regional or regionalist perspective. A lot of the ground has been covered already, especially Professor Rosa was talking about some theoretical, conceptual background about regionalism. And in that respect, I don't need to spend the limited time talking about the conceptual part. I will briefly mention the idea of regionalism, to what extent it plays a role in the making of Turkish foreign policy in general, and in that respect also to what extent a kind of regionalist vision drives Turkey's engagement in the Middle East. And when we look at overall Turkish foreign policy orientation, especially with the end of the Cold War, we see a big attention to the regional realities. Of course, for Turkey, the Cold War context hindered a regionalist foreign policy agenda, because a lot of the regional dynamics were dominated by the global dynamics as a result of the bipolar politics. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of a rather independent regional system or systems or subsystems surrounding Turkey. As a result, Turkey also started to pursue a very active regional or regionalist agenda, starting with the Balkans, the Black Sea context, the Caucasus, and eventually also in the Middle Eastern context, when we look at Turkey's foreign policy initiatives, engagements, regionalist agenda was always there in the sense of trying to instigate regional mechanisms, regional processes. So in that sense, most of the literature when we talk about Turkish foreign policy defines or tends to define Turkey as a regional power. But as a regional power, what we see, Turkey is also a kind of, in its own ways, a region builder in its own neighborhood. So in that sense, major initiatives, Black Sea Economic Cooperation Initiative in the Black Sea context, Turkey was playing a lead role. And then again, Turkey tried to initiate some regional platforms in the Balkans context. And then prior to the Arab Spring, when Turkey increasingly started to get involved in the Middle Eastern affairs, again, regionalization, regional initiatives such as the Quartet, including Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. These were the kind of projects Turkey was pursuing. So far, I even haven't mentioned the kind of cooperative schemes or projects involving Turkey and Turkish-speaking countries or Turkish nations in the former Soviet zone. So in that sense, the regionalism, the idea of instigating some regional mechanism was always there. But at the same time, we see that this regionalism, in a sense, went hand in hand with bilateralism. So in that sense, we cannot say that only regional initiatives are shaping Turkey's engagement. Where possible, Turkey did engage in many regional initiatives, but if not, we have seen quite a few examples of bilateral initiatives. And in recent years, again, we see increasing resort by Turkey to trilateral mechanisms. So in case where developing a regional mechanism faces certain challenges, we see Turkey is increasingly willing to go for trilateral or bilateral mechanisms, especially with the bilateral mechanisms. In recent years, we have seen this concept of high-level strategic cooperation councils, which were being developed with many neighboring countries as well as countries in different parts of the world. So regionalism is always there. But when we look at the general characteristics of Turkey's regional initiatives, Turkey's approach to regionalism, we see that inclusivity is a major part. So Turkey's understanding is that all relevant regional stakeholders should be part of the regional processes. So we see that sometimes this principle may potentially contradict with the realities of the regions. For instance, when we look at the Black Sea initiatives at the very beginning, considering Turkey's own issues with certain of the regional countries, despite all these problems, Turkey insisted on even including the countries with which it had bilateral problems as well, despite the fact that, for instance, Greece didn't have any shore to the Black Sea. Turkey also pushed to include Greece into that mechanism. And then when we look at certain initiatives in the Caucasus, recently, again, there is big discussion about this 3+3 format, which was also embraced by Moscow as well as Tehran to resolve the regional disputes. Again, despite all the bilateral problems, we have seen that Turkey was quite keen in getting Armenia part of the regional mechanisms. So inclusivity has always been there. And then another principle, it's a kind of motto, I will say, of Turkey's approach to regionalism is this notion of regional ownership, the fact that the regional countries The regional actors should take the matters to their own hands, should be the main reference points. And then this regional ownership also gives way to, in some cases, a kind of exclusive conceptions of region or regional mechanisms. What I mean here is the following. You know, we always have this discussion about how to classify the extra-regional actors when it comes to the regional mechanisms. And sometimes some actors prefer to get international players involved, but sometimes regionalism may actually be an instrument to exclude extra-regional actors, especially global powers. So increasingly, I feel that Turkey is seeking to use regional mechanisms sometimes to exclude global players that develop more kind of homegrown regionalism. So today, when we look at the Middle Eastern context, of course, Turkey has tested the limits of its engagement in the Middle East. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, prior to the Arab Spring, Turkey had a kind of ambitious agenda. In that respect, regionalism has become part of Turkey's power politics, power play in the region, because as a major regional power, Turkey also has ambitions for regional leadership as well. So in a sense, Turkey sees regionalist projects as an instrument to bolster its potential leadership bid. But what we have seen in the course of the Arab Spring, that vision has really faced challenges. And as a result, Turkey has run into certain problems, bilateral problems with quite a few of the regional countries. So in recent years, we have observed that Turkey right now is in the process of mending the bilateral disputes with quite a few of the regional actors. And as a result, I think Turkey realizes that the recent policies were in the region, there were disputes, disagreements between the key players, were not conducive, and they did really create a huge costs for Turkey, especially considering Turkey's economic model, which is based on the kind of export-led growth, trading and open economy. These are all important for Turkey. So in recent years, I think Turkey is seeking to fix certain bilateral disputes, but behind all these projects, there is still this regional vision, in the sense that to the extent that Turkey can fix bilateral disputes, it can also open the way for creating a kind of more inclusionary regional subsystem. But the experience of Turkey so far, the regional vision, the challenges it has encountered, based on those experiences, we say that the inherent problems, the roadblocks before regionalization in the Middle East, they are there. They are beyond Turkey's own ability to overcome the sectarian issues or other geopolitical disputes, the involvement of the foreign global players, so on and so forth. They create challenges that are beyond Turkey's ability to overcome. And therefore, as I said, Turkey realizes that you cannot just subscribe to a regional agenda only. You have to complement it with bilateral or other mechanisms. And I realize that time is also getting really late. So I stop here. And if there is any question, I will be happy to come back. I am here listening to you.
Is that working? Yes, it is working. Yes, a quick roundup. I think they've been trials to answer to the topical question: is it possible to set up a regional institution in the MENA region? But if it would be to give to the Caesar what belongs to the Caesar, going back to the 1945, this region would produce the first movement in the direction of boosting regional integration. That was the Arab League. So if you look in in terms of perspectives, I strongly believe that the region has enough masterminds and has enough resolve to put forward, when time comes, the necessary institutional architecture that they would get what they want. Very quickly, some personal notes. As some food for thought, I would venture a modest personal note on the perspectives of regional integration in the region. And for that to make sense, instead of limiting our focus on within the region, and the doctor from Turkey mentioned that several times, I would propose to complement it with an intellectual exercise to zoom out from the region to the upper regional integration projects in the global south. And we should do that from both a strategic perspective, given the intersection between domestic games of thrones in the region and the power politics prevailing over international relations at the moment and in the very foreseeable future. On the other hand, from a very functionalist perspective, as the Middle East itself stands as the crossroads for the newly emerging regional value chains, I predict that states in the region shall not scale down their appetite for bilateral free trade agreements, but at the same time, they shall show eagerness to hang up with the new dudes on the block in multilateral formats. The region itself is rather heterogeneous, therefore quite a lot of challenges to facilitate convergence on of the national interest. As the former patrons in the region, the US as the premier one and the EU as the junior one have made critical adjustments to their strategies in the region. The US pivot to Asia, as it was mentioned earlier, and EU global strategy, as it was made earlier, promoting principled pragmatism and acknowledging the emerging regional orders. And since their understanding and joint actions have lacked both political consensus and coherence, both of them have disqualified themselves as benign power brokers. And there seems to be quite a bit of consensus in the room about that. The rise of South Korea, Japan, India, Russia, and China, all of them increasingly articulating regional players, but also as drivers of emerging regional orders. I see a larger window of opportunity for the countries in the region to hook up to macro-regional organization. And I'll just pinpoint to two of them because they are the most advanced one, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has proved to have enough resolve and legitimacy to diffuse tension between Pakistan and India, welcoming both of these states on board, but also Eurasia Economic Union that has convened tones like dozens of free trade agreements, both up in the north, Tunisia, Morocco, you name it, and down in the south, Iran. As far as I know, I think it was last year that Iran concluded a free trade agreement. So there is a huge potential that would allow the states in the region to diffuse a bit of tension amongst themselves and meet up there in a macro, in a supra-macro institutional architecture, so they could gain more leverage power. And in the meantime, let history do its own course. Thanks a million. Enjoy your meals and looking forward for the afternoon sessions.